I still remember the day they lifted that torn wedding dress from the earth, the way the fabric clung to the roots of an old oak like it had been holding on for dear life. Mud had darkened the lace to a shade between ivory and ash, and the air around it felt still, like even the woods knew to keep quiet. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Most mornings in Maple Hollow began with the smell of fresh coffee and the faint hum of the paper mill down by Pine Creek. By sunrise, Main Street was already alive, mail trucks idling at the curb, the diner's screen door squeaking open and shut, and Ruth Hart's laughter drifting across the street as she watered her front porch ferns. Back then, we all thought we lived in the safest corner of Pennsylvania, a town small enough for everyone to wave, but big enough to feel like the world worked the way it should. I'd been the postmaster for nearly 30 years, which meant I knew the rhythm of every household. The Harts especially were steady folks. Tom ran the service bay behind Miller's Auto, and Ruth sang alto in the church choir every Sunday without fail. Their daughter Emily taught Sunday school and had the kind of soft-spoken patience people noticed. When she and Daniel Price announced their engagement, it felt like the town itself smiled. There was nothing dramatic about it. No whirlwind romance, no scandal, just two good people starting their life together. That summer before the wedding, I saw them often at the post office. Emily mailed thank you notes in pale blue envelopes, her handwriting neat and rounded. Daniel would wait outside in his pickup, tapping the steering wheel to the radio. They had that quiet comfort you see in couples who've known each other a long time, not loud about their love, but sure of it. By September, the whole town had wedding fever. Ruth and the ladies from church were up to their elbows in ribbon and lace, fussing over centerpieces. Tom built a wooden arch for the churchyard, painting it white in the evenings, while Ruth sat nearby with lemonade. And every time I passed, I heard them talking about how perfect October would be. Not too hot, not too cold, leaves bright enough to make the photographs look like paintings. Maple Hollow wasn't the kind of place that saw much trouble. The biggest story that year had been a bear nosing through the school dumpsters. Folks left their keys and their ignitions doors unlocked, and gossip stayed friendly. The most excitement we'd had was the homecoming parade and the occasional wedding at the church on Main. I remember the Friday before the ceremony. Ruth came into the post office carrying a stack of invitations that had been returned for bad addresses. She smiled, but I could tell she was tired, the kind of tired that comes from making sure every little thing is perfect. She said Emily had been up late the night before sewing the final bead onto her veil. She wants everything just right, Ruth told me. That girl's been dreaming of this since she could walk. On Saturday morning, October 15th, the sun came up over Maple Hollow like a blessing. The sky was the color of cornflowers, the air cool enough to see your breath. I drove down Main Street around 8 on my way to the hardware store and saw folks already gathering near the church. The white steeple caught the light, and the front steps were lined with mums in every shade of orange. There was a sense of celebration hanging in the air, one of those mornings where the whole town feels like it's taking part in something good. I passed Daniel's truck parked by the curb and gave him a wave. He grinned and lifted his coffee cup, that easy, nervous kind of happiness every groom wears on his face. Around the corner, I caught sight of Ruth and Tom standing with Emily, who was still in her robe, holding her bouquet up to the light, like she was trying to memorize its color. She waved at me, and I waved back. That was the last time I saw her smile in person. The church bells rang out just before noon that day, their sound carrying clear across the valley. The music mixed with the chatter of guests arriving, the shuffle of shoes on the stone path, and the creak of the old front doors opening and closing. Inside, the air smelled of flowers and floor polish. You could feel that mixture of joy and nerves that comes right before a wedding, the kind that makes even strangers hold their breath when the organ starts to play. Out in the hallway, Ruth was fixing her daughter's veil, smoothing the lace down gently, while Leah, the maid of honor, teased her about walking too fast. Emily laughed that soft, shy laugh everyone knew. "I just want it to be perfect," she said. At the time, nothing felt out of place. No tension, no worry, just a Saturday morning in a small Pennsylvania town. If anything seemed unusual, it was only a small thing I noticed later. A cream-colored sedan parked by the alley behind the church. It wasn't a car I recognized, and in a town like ours, that alone was rare. But on that morning, I barely gave it a second glance. There were always visitors on wedding days. Relatives from out of town, photographers, florists. Around 11:30, as guests filled the pews, I remember standing outside taking in the scene. The sun was warm on the brick walkway, and the wind carried the smell of pine from the ridge. Emily stepped out onto the grass just for a moment, holding her bouquet up against the light. Someone snapped a few pictures with a disposable camera, those quick, simple photos folks used before everything went digital. She looked peaceful, a little distant maybe, but happy. Inside, Daniel was waiting with his best man. He kept checking his watch, rubbing his hands together. I remember thinking he looked more nervous than most, but that was natural. No groom ever feels ready for that moment when the doors open. By noon, everything was set. The minister gave a nod to the organist, and the music started up again, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. I was standing in the back row when Ruth came down the aisle, smiling and teary-eyed. Behind her, the flower girls fidgeted and the ushers straightened their ties. It was one of those moments that felt suspended in time, where everything seems exactly as it should be. And then, the moment simply stretched. The music played longer than it should have. The doors stayed closed a beat too long. The minister glanced toward the vestibule, unsure. Daniel turned slightly, expecting movement. None came. The organist faltered for a moment, then began again, softer this time, as though filling the space where something was missing. People whispered, then fell quiet again. I remember the way the light shifted through the stained glass, spreading color across the floor. It was beautiful and wrong at the same time, like watching a scene wait for its main character to arrive. When the music stopped altogether, the hush that followed was so deep you could hear the faint ticking of the church clock. A few guests chuckled nervously, thinking maybe it was a wardrobe mishap or a delay in the photographs. No one in that room, not one of us, imagined how long that silence would last. Outside, the air had cooled a few degrees, and clouds were gathering along the ridge. The breeze carried the smell of rain and the rustle of leaves skittering along the sidewalk. I remember stepping onto the porch, half expecting to see Emily walking up the path, veil, fluttering, laughing about being late. But all I saw were the mums swaying in the wind petals scattering across the steps. The church bell struck 12, clear and hollow. Inside, the minister cleared his throat, waiting for someone to speak. Daniel shifted from foot to foot, hands trembling slightly. Ruth pressed a handkerchief to her lips. And there, standing in the doorway, I felt a small unease. Something quiet and heavy like the air right before a storm breaks. That was the last ordinary moment Maple Hollow ever had. The next time the town gathered in that church, it wasn't for a wedding. It was for prayers that never found their answers. That music stopped in such an odd way. 1 second it was filling the whole church, warm and slow, familiar, like it always was, and the next it just faded out as if someone had quietly lifted the needle off the record. You could hear a hush settle soft at first. A few heads turned toward the vestibule. People adjusted in their seats, smiled at each other, waiting. I remember someone behind me whispered, "Maybe she needs another minute," and that made sense. Brides get overwhelmed. Maybe she was touching up her lipstick or wiping away tears. That kind of day does that to people. But 5 minutes turned into 10. The minister checked his watch. Leah had disappeared back down the hallway with a furrow in her brow. Daniel stood still at the front, hands clasped in front of him, eyes locked on the doors that were supposed to open wide any moment now. I could see his fingers' fidget thumb pressing into palm like he was trying to anchor himself. The ushers whispered near the back, One of the flower girls began to shift nervously in her shoes. Ruth, sitting in the second pew, folded and refolded a handkerchief without blinking. And still, no sign of Emily. I stepped outside when Daniel did. He wasn't running or shouting, just walking quickly like he'd suddenly remembered something he was supposed to check on himself. His shoes echoed off the walkway. The mums on the church steps had begun to wilt in the sun petals curling at the edges. He looked toward the churchyard, then toward the alley, then doubled back to the side path. I followed a few steps behind without a word. You didn't have to be told something wasn't right. You could feel it. We checked the dressing room first, that little side space near the basement stairs where brides have always gotten ready, full-length mirror, an old wooden vanity, and a coat hook where the gown bag still hung empty now. Inside her purse sat untouched. Lipstick still uncapped. A comb, some tissues. The kind of scattered traces a person leaves behind when they're coming right back. But she hadn't come back. Leah was the next to speak, her voice small but clear. She said Emily had stepped outside just after 11 holding her bouquet. Said she wanted a little fresh air before the music began. A few folks had taken photos of coarse disposables, mostly the kind we all used back then, single-use film and flash bulbs. I remembered seeing her standing in the grass earlier, right near the hedgerow by the side gate. She was smiling at someone off camera in one frame, but the next was different. The guests waited quietly for a while, still thinking maybe she'd lost track of time. Maybe a bird had startled her veil loose and she was fixing it, laughing to herself. But as the clock crept toward 1 o'clock, the silence inside the church turned heavy, expectant. No one dared say the word missing. Not yet. But that's what it had become. By mid-afternoon, 2 police cruisers rolled up the hill. The officers stepped out cautiously, like they weren't sure if this was real or some misunderstanding. One of them was Deputy Lang, who knew the Harts well. He used to come by Tom's garage for tune-ups. He tried to be gentle when he asked the first round of questions. When's the last time anyone saw her? Did she mention anything odd this morning? Could she have stepped out and gotten turned around? But there wasn't a single piece of this that felt like someone who had simply gone for a walk. Her car was still parked at home. No purse, no wallet, no good reason. They fanned out around the church. I watched the first few officers walk the perimeter, checking hedges and alleyways. Volunteers, neighbors, cousins, a few off-duty firefighters formed loose search lines, calling her name like she'd wandered off or fainted somewhere. But by sundown, not one piece of clothing, not one shoe, not a single flower from her bouquet had turned up. Only that one strip of white satin ribbon pressed into the dust by the parsonage gate like it had slipped free in a hurry. I don't remember exactly who found it, but when they held it up, Ruth let out a sound I still can't quite describe. It wasn't a cry or a scream, more like something broke in her chest. She reached for it and then stopped halfway, hand trembling. That was hers, she said. We tied the bouquet with it this morning. Daniel sat on the front steps by then, staring out across the street like he wasn't seeing anything at all. When the officers tried to speak with him, he just nodded and gave the same answers over and over. They'd spoken the night before, yes. She was excited, yes. She hadn't said anything about running off, not once. She loved this town, he said quietly. She was going to teach here. We were going to stay here. Some folks whispered that maybe she had changed her mind. Cold feet, they said. But those who knew Emily pushed back on that hard. She'd spent months planning every detail of that day's stationary seating, charts, the little lavender sachets in the pews. She wasn't the kind of girl to vanish without a trace, not on her own. In the days that followed, the church stayed quiet, doors shut tight. The cake sat in the Harts' freezer. The bouquets began to wilt water in the vases, turning cloudy. The bulletin board still had the wedding program pinned to it, a photo of Emily and Daniel, smiling arms around each other, unaware that time would freeze them like that forever. The photographs came back from the developer 2 days later. We all gathered in Ruth and Tom's living room when the prints were laid out. Most showed what you'd expect Emily with her bridesmaids adjusting her veil in the mirror, smiling with Ruth outside. But one photo stopped us cold. Emily standing alone near the side yard, her head turned sharply toward the alley, eyes narrowed like she saw something none of us did. In the far right edge of the frame, barely there, was the door of a cream-colored car, cracked open, chrome glinting in the sunlight, just enough to make your stomach tighten. Deputies followed up on it quickly. They canvassed auto shops and lots in a 50-mile radius looking for that make and model. Late 80s or early 90s sedan cream or off-white, possibly local. But there were thousands of those still on the road. And no license plate. No match. Leah, poor thing, looked like she hadn't slept since the wedding day. She said something that stuck with me. Emily kept a letter in her wallet, she said. She wrote it over the summer in a hotel room when she was visiting her cousin. Just a note to herself. About being brave. About not letting other people decide her life for her. She didn't think it was a goodbye, not even close. More like a reminder. Still, the detectives wrote it down. Some started to wonder whether Emily had stepped toward that car willingly. Whether it was someone she knew. An old friend, a stranger offering help, maybe even someone who'd watched her for weeks. It was all guesses. Nothing fit cleanly. Search parties combed the woods that week. Pine Valley, the quarry trails, the railroad ditch out past the feed store. They brought in dogs, even a state helicopter, for a day or two, scanning the hills for any sign of disturbed ground. But it was like chasing fog. Her scent disappeared just past the church gate, as if she'd stepped through a door only she could see. Tom went out each morning before the sun came up, drove the back roads, checked every pull-off and culvert between here and the next county. Ruth stayed home waiting by the phone, every ring jerking her heart up into her throat. I saw them both change during that week. Their posture, their eyes, the way they spoke. Hope has a shape when it starts. It's bright and forward-looking, but grief, it bends people inward. Daniel stayed with his brother for a while. Couldn't sleep in the house where he and Emily had planned to start their life. People kept talking, some saying he was grieving, others saying he was hiding. I don't think he heard any of it, just drifted through town like a man underwater. One night, around 10 days after she vanished, I remember walking past the church. The porch light was still on even though nobody was inside. Moths danced around the bulb. Wind moved through the hedges with that rustling, dry sound leaves make in October. I stood there for a minute, hands in my coat pockets, listening. Somewhere close by, a dog barked once and fell silent. A car passed down Main Street, headlights flashing over the wet pavement. But the light from the church that stayed steady, like it was still waiting to guide someone home. And I remember thinking then, what if that was all we'd ever get? A porch light left on too long. A dress that was never worn again. A day that began with promise and ended in silence that still hasn't broken. That silence, we're still living with it. But at the time, we didn't know it would last. We still thought she'd walk back in, any minute now, any day. And so we waited. By the second week, the flyers had started to curl at the edges. You'd see them fluttering in the windows of the pharmacy, the diner stapled to telephone poles with little rain-soaked corners. Emily Hart, 26. Last seen wearing a white satin wedding gown, veil, pinned-back bouquet of roses in hand. If you have information, and then the number printed in bold, I'd pass one every morning on my walk to the post office and pause just long enough to feel a tightness in my chest. Her face on those flyers, that soft smile she always had, it didn't belong under the word missing. It belonged in a frame on a mantel. The first few days after she disappeared, folks still spoke in hopeful tones. She'll turn up, they said. She probably just needed some space. But as time crept on and nothing surfaced, no phone call, no note, no sign, hope started turning into something quieter. A sort of waiting without expectation. The kind where folks say less because they're afraid of what comes next. The search became more methodical. Deputies went door to door re-interviewing anyone who had been at the church. They canvassed a 10-mile radius, pulling surveillance footage from gas stations and traffic lights. But this was 1994. Technology was nowhere near what it is today. No GPS, no smart cameras. Half the town still used landlines. So much depended on memory, and memories are slippery things. I remember sitting on my porch one evening with Tom Hart. He didn't say much, just held his coffee mug between both hands and stared out toward the edge of the trees. After a long silence, he said, "She wouldn't just leave Sam, not without saying goodbye." Then he rubbed at his face like a man trying to scrub off a dream. I know she wouldn't. The alley behind the church became a point of focus. That's where the ribbon was found, white satin, torn at one end, flattened into the dust, just beyond the parsonage gate. Forensics were limited. It matched the kind used on her bouquet, but it couldn't tell them who dropped it or when. Still, it was something. And in a case like this, something can carry the weight of everything. People talked as they always do. Rumors swirled like leaves in the wind. Some said Daniel had secrets. Others pointed to Leah, wondering what she might have known but hadn't said. The town, which once wrapped its arms around the Hart family, began to fracture. Trust started to pull at the seams. It was never outright accusation, just glances that lingered too long. Small silences that used to be filled with neighborly chatter. One woman at the diner swore she'd seen a woman in a white dress hitchhiking near Route 80 2 days after the wedding. Another claimed she'd served Emily pie and coffee in a roadside cafe near Harrisburg. But when detectives followed up, the timelines didn't match and the descriptions blurred with each retelling. It was hard to tell whether people genuinely remembered something or wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves. The cream-colored sedan became a kind of ghost. It came up in nearly every conversation. A retiree thought she'd seen it idling by the alley just before noon. A boy on his bike said he saw a woman in white near the church gate, but every time they pressed him, the details changed. Maybe it was before the bells rang. Maybe it was after. Maybe it wasn't a wedding dress at all. Leah was quiet in those weeks. She stayed mostly at home, except for when she brought casseroles over to the Harts or checked in with detectives. I remember seeing her once in the grocery store, staring at a row of cereal boxes not moving. She looked like someone whose thoughts had been frozen mid-sentence. Folks talked behind her back, too, wondering why Emily hadn't said more to her best friend, whether she'd confided anything in those last few hours. The church remained closed. No weddings were scheduled there for months after. People said it felt wrong, like walking through someone else's sorrow. I think they were right. Every time I passed those front steps, I half expected to hear organ music or see petals scattered across the walkway again. Instead, it was just quiet. That October stretched on like a bruise. Police brought in cadaver dogs from the next county. They swept the woods east of town, followed old trails, and circled back to the quarry where teenagers used to sneak off in the summer. One dog caught a trace near the edge of Pine Valley, a scent trail, they said, but it disappeared within yards. Nothing tangible, just more questions. By winter, detectives admitted they were running out of leads. The investigation hadn't stopped, but it had slowed, and folks started to feel that in their bones. The Harts held on to any sliver of possibility. Ruth kept Emily's bedroom untouched, pillows fluffed a small glass angel sitting on the windowsill. Tom drove the back roads daily, stopping at every abandoned shed and overgrown path he thought police might have missed. He told me once that the only thing worse than not finding her was the thought of her being somewhere no one had looked. Every October after that brought back the ache. Reporters would come in with their microphones and sad eyes trying to recapture the story for TV. They'd point their cameras at the church steps and ask the same old questions. Where were you that day? What do you think happened? And then they'd leave their stories cut and packaged for a segment before weather and sports. Daniel moved away 6 months after it happened. He tried to stay, but the eyes on him were too many. Every trip to the grocery store, every coffee at the diner came with whispers. Why isn't he talking more? Why doesn't he help with the search? Truth is, he did everything they asked. But grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it just wants to disappear. There were false leads in every direction. A psychic mailed a hand-drawn map claiming Emily was buried near a bend in the river. Deputies searched the spot, found nothing but an old tractor tire and 2 rusted lawn chairs. Another woman swore she'd seen Emily boarding a Greyhound in Ohio. But ticket records didn't check out, and the security camera showed a different woman altogether. These dead ends didn't just stall the case, they reopened the wound each time. Ruth would get hopeful, then quiet. Tom would pace the porch more than usual. It was like watching someone try to grab smoke. The case officially was never closed. Cold, yes. Forgotten, no. The bulletin board at the sheriff's office still held her wedding photo, faded now, corners curled. New deputies were briefed on her file, told it was still active. But in time, it became part of the town's landscape. Part of the silence we all lived with. And yet, for all the silence, there was one moment 9 years later when that stillness finally cracked. It didn't come from a detective or a phone tip. It came from the woods. 2 hikers had stopped to rest in Pine Valley, not far from the ridge where Tom used to scan with binoculars. One of them noticed a bit of fabric tangled in the roots of a fallen oak. They thought it might be a tarp or an old sheet. But when they pulled it from the dirt, what they found sent them scrambling back down the trail. The gown. Emily's wedding dress. I wasn't there when they brought it in, but I was at the sheriff's office the next morning when word spread. Mud-stained, torn, heavy with moisture, the lace along the sleeves still visible under the dirt. A single pearl button clinging to the back seam. Officers handled it like it was made of glass. A relic. A wound reopened. For the Harts, it was confirmation Emily had not simply vanished on her own. She had been taken, moved, hidden. But if the dress had made it to Pine Valley, how? And when had it been there all those years, exposed to the rain and snow, quietly rotting beneath the tree roots? Or had someone placed it there later, knowing what it would stir up? There were no bones nearby. No shoes, no jewelry, just the dress tangled and half swallowed by the woods. We all held our breath again. And this time the questions felt heavier. Because what had once been a mystery of absence had now become a mystery of presence. The dress had come back. But Emily hadn't. And in the stillness that followed, we all understood something unspoken. This wasn't closure. This was the beginning of a deeper, darker search. One that would pull us further into the shadows of what we thought we knew. When they pulled the wedding dress from the dirt, something changed in the air, not just in the room where the deputies stood, but in town, in our bones. It had been 9 years since Emily vanished, and most folks had started calling it a cold case, even if they never said it out loud. But now there it was, tangled in tree roots like it had grown there, heavy with moisture and time. The lace was almost the same. Same pattern down the sleeves. Same tiny pearl buttons clinging to the back like they hadn't noticed the years passing. Ruth didn't want to see it, not at first. She just sat still in the kitchen listening. When someone finally showed her a photograph, she nodded once, then turned her face away. "That was hers," she whispered. She wore that morning like it was stitched to her future. They sent the dress to the state lab, bagged and boxed, every piece of thread cataloged like evidence from a war. But what came back wasn't what we hoped. No blood, no trace of struggle, no fingerprints, no skin cells, no foreign hair that could lead to someone else's name. Just a faint strand that had degraded past use. The soil clinging to the hem matched the Pine Valley woods, which meant the dress had been there a long time. Not days, not weeks. Years. But even that wasn't clear. Weather plays tricks, and the ground doesn't give up its secrets easily. Some thought it had been buried shallow and pulled back up by rain or by animals. Others believed someone had returned later, placing it there on purpose. Like a marker. Like a message. We gathered around the table at the post office the morning after the lab report came back. A few of us still helped the sheriff's department now and then, retired or semi-retired folks who couldn't shake the habit of wanting to help. We laid out what little we had, the dress, the ribbon from the alley, the old photo with the sliver of that pale car door. It didn't add up. If she was taken, why leave the dress? Why not the shoes or the veil or nothing at all? If she ran, why carry something so recognizable into the woods and abandon it? Detectives looked again at the people closest to her. Daniel was brought in for another round of questions. He was remarried by then, living 2 states over, and when they reached him, he didn't hesitate. Said he'd fly in the next morning. He looked tired, older, in a way that wasn't just about age. I was in the hallway when he came out of the interview. He stopped beside the vending machine, rubbed the back of his neck, and said, "It doesn't go away. People think it fades, but it just changes shape." Then he walked off without waiting for a reply. They questioned Leah again, too. She sat with her hands folded, eyes red but steady. She told them the same thing she'd said years ago, that the letter Emily carried wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise to herself. She was scared sometimes, Leah said, but not of Daniel, not of the wedding. She was scared of disappearing into something she didn't choose. That stuck with me. Not because it sounded like someone planning to leave, but because it sounded like someone trying hard to stay. For a while, the dress sat locked in evidence, quiet and unchanging, while the town swirled back into old habits. Folks had opinions, as they always do. Some believed it proved Daniel had lied all along, though the timeline still held. He'd been at the altar when Emily vanished. Others leaned toward Leah, thought she was too composed, too central, always near, but never with an answer. The rest blamed someone unknown. A stranger passing through someone with knowledge of the back trails, someone who watched and waited. And then came the box. It was spring again, almost 20 years since that October morning. A group of volunteers had gone out to clean part of the Pine Valley trailhead, mostly picking up cans, clearing brush. One of them caught the edge of something with a rake, a dull clank beneath the soil. They thought it was a rusted pipe at first, but when they dug it out, it was metal rectangular, heavy with damp. They didn't open it themselves. They called it in, stood back, waited in silence. When the deputies lifted the lid, the smell of old earth rose up like breath held too long. Inside were 3 things: a pair of satin shoes, stained and sunken, still holding their shape. A stem wrapped in ribbon long rotted the faint outline of where flowers had once been tied. And an envelope folded water-damaged but still intact. On the front in handwriting all of us recognized was her name. Emily Hart. They handled it like it might fall apart in their hands. The paper had yellowed and the ink had bled in places, but most of it was legible. It wasn't a confession, not even a goodbye. Just a note to herself, one she'd written months before the wedding, back when she'd been visiting a cousin up north. "When I am afraid," it said, "I will remember this is what I wanted. Love is not fear." That was all. A quiet mantra from a woman trying to hold steady in the current. Ruth held the shoes in her lap for a long time. She didn't cry. She just ran her fingers over the toe of one like she was trying to remember where it had been. Tom stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, staring down at the ribbon. "We tied that bouquet together," he said softly. "That morning. I remember watching her do it." Then he turned away and didn't say anything else for the rest of the day. Forensics confirmed the items were old, likely buried for nearly as long as she'd been gone. No fingerprints beyond Emily's. No signs of struggle. The soil on the shoes matched the upper ridge above the trailhead, close to where the dress had been found, but not quite the same spot, which meant whoever buried the box had chosen that place deliberately. They hadn't dropped it while running. They'd placed it there. And if the bouquet ribbon matched the scrap found by the church gate, then whoever left it in the woods had carried it all the way from the alley to that hollow. That set off a whole new wave of speculation. Some believed it was a memorial of sorts left by someone who cared, someone who grieved in secret. Others thought it was a taunt, a way to stir up the case again, to relight a fire that had gone cold. A few held fast to the idea that Emily herself had hidden it, though that never sat right with me. You don't bury your own shoes and bouquet on the day of your wedding unless you're trying to vanish into myth. And Emily was a lot of things, but not that. Detectives circled back to everyone again. Daniel, growing sharper with age, said plainly, "I lost her too." He refused to answer further questions, but his alibi still held. Leah broke down when she saw the letter again, said she remembered Emily writing it during a weekend trip, sitting on the bed of a motel with a pen in one hand and her head in the other. It was just for her, she said. Something to hold on to. But the unease returned. The feeling that someone in town knew more than they'd ever said. That someone had kept her belongings hidden for nearly 2 decades, only to place them in the woods piece by piece like breadcrumbs back to nothing. We had her dress, her shoes, the ribbon, the letter, but not her. That fall, the trail near Pine Valley started drawing people again. Quiet ones. Some brought flowers, others just stood near the tree where the dress had been found. The box, after being photographed and catalogued, sat locked away. And still the question hung there like fog. Was it a goodbye or a reminder? A grave or a clue? For all the pieces we'd found, there was still no body, no bones, no closure, just fragments. And the longer we stared at them, the more it felt like the person who left them wanted it that way. The air grew colder again as winter crept in. And still somewhere out there beyond the tree line, beyond the edge of town, was the rest of Emily's story waiting. Or maybe not. Maybe this was all we were ever meant to find. Pieces. The kind that keep you looking. The kind that never let you sleep. Some nights, when the air's real still and the porch light catches the dew on the grass just right, I still think I'll hear her footsteps. Just soft ones, heels on concrete, the brush of a bouquet against her side. Maybe that's just how memory works when you've lived too long with silence. You start filling it with sound that never really comes. After they found that rusted box near the tree line shoes ribbon letter, things got quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet. Not like those first weeks when we were waiting for Emily to walk back through the door. This was different. This was a quiet that settled deep into people's bones. It didn't ask for answers anymore. It just lived alongside the not knowing. The investigation didn't stop, not officially. There were still files open, notes added, old interviews revisited by new detectives trying to find something everyone else missed. There was even another tip line set up after the box made national news. But nothing ever came from it. No confession, no new name, no set of remains to bury. The story just kind of stayed. A mystery that never let go of its edges. Tom Hart kept driving those back roads every few days. He never said he was looking, not anymore, but he always carried a flashlight in the truck, a small spade, and a binder full of marked maps and hand-sketched notes. There was something ritualistic about it. Not because he expected to find her, but because doing nothing would have felt worse. He once told me it's not about finding her now. It's about making sure nobody forgets we still are. Ruth stopped answering the phone when strangers called. She kept the letter in a frame behind glass on her dresser, said she didn't want it out in the open, but also didn't want it locked away. Every October, she still left flowers at the church steps, always the same color roses Emily carried that morning. They stayed fresh for a while, but eventually the wind would take them. That was part of it too, I guess. Daniel moved again. Last I heard, he was in upstate New York with his second wife and a little boy. He never returned to Maple Hollow after that last round of questioning, and truthfully, I don't blame him. Some folks still whispered when his name came up, though the ones who knew him well had stopped pointing fingers years ago. Grief changes people in ways you can't always see from the outside. I think he carried enough weight on his own without needing ours added to it. Leah still lives here, teaches 3rd grade now. She walks with a kind of gentleness you don't notice until you watch her. A while pauses at every crosswalk, lets the kids finish their thoughts before she interrupts. There's a softness in her that feels worn thin in places, like someone who keeps carrying a memory that doesn't quite belong to her. We speak sometimes at the store or during school fundraisers. She always asks how Tom and Ruth are holding up, always says Emily's name like it still fits easily in her mouth. As for the case, it never had that ending people hope for. No grave, no charges, no justice in the way people usually measure it. But there's a kind of truth that settled in anyway. A quiet truth that someone somewhere still knows. That maybe they moved on had children changed their name. Or maybe they stayed close thinking time would cover what they did. Maybe they meant to bury more than just a dress and a ribbon. Maybe they thought they buried the story too. But they didn't. Because even after all these years, you can still feel it here. Not loud, not always, but in small ways. In the way the trail at Pine Valley never quite lost its hush. In the way teenagers still dare each other to walk it at night. In how people leave little things on the fallen tree flowers. Pennies, sometimes just their names carved into the bark, like they're trying to say, I was here. I remember. Detectives came and went. Some looked at the evidence with fresh eyes. Some didn't last long. One detective, Callahan, put in more time than most. He ran new tests on the soil from the dress, did some pollen analysis, even tried ground-penetrating radar in the woods. They found fragments, small threads of cloth pieces likely moved by weather or animals, but never anything else that led them to her. He told me once, after a long day walking those trails, you'd think with all these clues, this timeline, we'd have something solid. But it's like the story was written to keep just out of reach. I think about that a lot. About how some stories aren't meant to end neatly. How the answers we want aren't always the ones we get. And how sometimes even when the world keeps spinning, a place like Maple Hollow stays suspended in a moment. The church still holds weddings. New couples walk down the aisle, say vows under that old wooden arch Tom built with his own hands. But the space near the side gate, the place where Emily was last seen, feels different. Not haunted, just watched. Like the past lingers there, not angry, just waiting. We've learned how to live with it, the not knowing, the fragments, the echo of that October morning. And in a way, I think we've learned to carry it with care, not as gossip or legend, but as remembrance. Emily Hart didn't just vanish. She was here. She smiled under sunlight, held roses in her hands, and walked the grass outside the church like any bride would. That matters. The way a person lives, how they move, what they leave behind, that matters more than what someone else tried to take. And maybe that's what stayed with me most. That no matter how many years pass, no matter how many cases pile up or names get lost in folders, some stories hold on. Not because they're unresolved, but because they ask something of us. They ask us to stay aware, to care about someone we may have never met, to notice what's missing and remember what shouldn't be forgotten. So if you ever walk a quiet trail and feel the air shift, if you ever pass a place where something lingers, you'll understand what I mean. Some silences aren't empty. They're waiting. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. And if you've ever walked through a quiet place and felt a story still hanging in the air, let me know where you're listening from. Every voice helps keep their memory alive.